Okay, when I start talking about educational institutions, I can very quickly go down the rabbit hole because there's so much to talk about them. But I'll try to be as brief as I can and just give you a framework and some key terms. And then after we're done with the presentations and we have our broader discussion about action, I'll give you a lot of the websites where you can follow up with more information on this. What's key to understand is, we gathered this meeting because of the alarm that was sounded in Austin about curriculum being introduced in a very kind of sideways fashion into the schools without the parents really knowing about the fact that their children were slowly being exposed to more and more curriculum, and specifically the LGBT curriculum. And I know that many of us have people in our lives who identify as gay or bisexual, as transgender, and I'm not going to be talking about them or their salvation or their choices. We're talking about the organizations that are behind this. Organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, GLAAD, the gay advocacy wings of the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's important to understand that those organizations don't really represent gay people. They're actually quite removed from many people who are in the LGBT community, and I know that because I grew up in the LGBT community, and many of the people that I loved and cared for were never well represented by a group like the Human Rights Campaign. But we have to deal with who the Human Rights Campaign and those organizations are. These are massive fundraising operations. They take in tens of millions of dollars a year. Many of them have hundreds of million dollars in holdings. Their principal focus is on two groups: young people and the people who disagree with them. They put a lot of their money towards schools or programs in order to really kind of push young people to identify this way and to get into the lifestyle and to stay there for as long as they can. And they spend a lot of money trying to punish people who are adults for disagreeing with them. And that includes people who are gay or bisexual or transgender or identify that way. Often those people are also punished if they disagree with groups like the Human Rights Campaign. All right? The thing about it is that it often boils down to the Human Rights Campaign against traditional associations, typically churches. And these two groups are fighting over the schools. The thing is that I count myself on the side of the churches. A group like the Southern Baptist Convention can take in a great deal of money in a year, but we have to spend it on programs. We have to actually run religious schools. We have to keep the churches running. We do charities. We have international missions all over the world. And we kind of have metrics. We have things that we have to answer to. How many people are we educating? How many people are we feeding? The gay lobbying organizations do not have metrics. They don't have to prove to their funders, I helped this many adult gay people avoid suicide. They don't provide services. So they have huge amounts of money that they can spend on advocacy, on suing people, on creating social media campaigns. So it's unequal warfare, okay? So what happens then when you have the educational institution? In my case, I was a university professor. I still am. It's been 20 years. But educational institutions are caught in the middle because on the one hand, you have the LGBT organizations who want very much to get into that system and they want to reach those young people, all right? On the other hand, you have a lot of adults who are operating the universities. Many of them are people of faith or people who have traditional beliefs, and they're in positions of power, and they will want to put the stop on some of these changes for the good of their mission as a college or as a school, which is to prepare young people for life. So you're caught in the middle of this. It's an unequal battle because ultimately the LGBT organizations have so much money and they don't have to spread it across services to a lot of people. They can direct it at basically bribery at a few high officials. They can make very strong defamation campaigns against a certain outspoken teacher or professor or administrator, put their name on the internet. They can send out people to do opposition research on that person, find out where they go to church, find out who their friends are, poison everyone against that person. All they have to do is make one bad example, and they have a huge victory. So we have to look then at how is it that a simple sign like the fact that Carol here Sister Carol, was called in and told that she was going to have to teach homosexuality to 4-year-olds in one school in Austin. Should you worry about that? You know, should you feel like anything's wrong with that? And I say yes, because the problem is that you have to understand the structure of education as an institution. It's based on 5 basic activities, and if you remember nothing else from what I tell you, remember these 5 terms, because these are the 5 terms you want to go back and you want to keep an eye on, and you want to see how they're being fundamentally changed as this curriculum gets into the system. The first is research. The second is teaching. The third is service. The fourth is credentialing, and the fifth is administration. Every teacher, every person who works in education, every institution that's involved in education is judged by those 5 levels. At the research level, how do we produce knowledge? How do we decide what knowledge is? How do we go out and find out what the truth is? The money pouring in from the LGBT groups distorts the research for a number of reasons. First of all, they can hire a professor to do a study, and often what they do is they have very unscrupulous ways of deciding who's going to be answering the questions, who's going to be in the sample. And because of the fact that there are laws, for instance, when you're doing research about young people, it's very difficult to actually get accurate, true research about many of these issues in the young. You can't just go and get people's grades because there are privacy laws. You can't just go and get their medical records because there's HIPAA laws. There are subject testing guidelines which say that you cannot ethically ask a subject a question that you know is going to traumatize them. So you can't ask a 7-year-old who's being raised by 2 gay men, how do you feel about homosexuality, or something like that, that's going to really invoke a strong reaction in that person. So how do you get the information? How do you collect the data? Usually, it is self-reported data from respondents who are either carefully chosen by the researcher or they themselves volunteer to be part of the study. So the vast majority of the research that's out there is basically not worth anything. And I learned this because one of the big pushes with the curriculum was they wanted to expand the presence of, or the knowledge of, same-sex parenting families in schools. And they kept on citing hundreds of studies that showed that kids who were raised in gay homes were very, very happy. Having myself been raised by a lesbian mother with the help of her lifelong female partner, and having compiled the testimonials of dozens of people who were raised in similar situations, I just couldn't get what I saw from experience to match the data. And I realized it's because the studies were all largely, 85%, I don't want to give a specific percentage because I'll get caught out there, but the vast majority of them were self-reported by the gay adults who were raising children. Basically, they got 40 lesbian mothers in San Francisco to say, how do you like raising kids? And they said, oh, we're doing a great job. And then that gets published, okay? The research gets heavily pressured because how do things get published in peer-reviewed journals? Well, you have to get funding to do the research, all right? So you have to get your application for funding approved, then you have to do the research, then you send your findings to a journal, and it has to pass peer review. So there are typically 3 experts in the field, and at least 2 of them have to say, yes, this is publishable, all right? Then it gets published. Well, what happens if you come up with findings that are not suitable to the LGBT agenda? And I'll give you 3 examples. Cal State Northridge, where I taught, University of Texas at Austin, where Mark Rigneris taught, and Johns Hopkins University, where Paul McHugh is an emeritus professor. In all of those cases, we published things in academic settings, and the findings were not favorable to the LGBT agenda, so what does the lobby do? They have all that extra money. They can mount huge pressure campaigns against the editors, they find out who the peer reviewers were, right? And they find out who was it that approved the thing. They go and they find out who funded it. They call your provost, they call your coworkers, they recruit students to file complaints against you. The backlash is enormous. So the research is all being done under duress. You get a little bit of the curriculum in, and that's the door, that's the camel's nose inside the tent. At teaching, this is another thing. Once you start to accept certain standards and you have to say that we're an inclusive school, we're a welcoming school, we're an anti-bullying school, and you introduce these topics, all of a sudden you have many hours during the day where a teacher is in front of a large number of students and they're having to discuss very controversial issues, and they say one wrong thing and they could be subject to a complaint. Once a complaint is filed, all right, and this is one of the things that the activists discovered, that the complaint system was the key way that they could force their will onto schools, because according to most of the laws, once a complaint is filed, it goes behind a veil of confidentiality. The person who's been accused, the teacher, more often than not, is not allowed to discuss it with the public. Sometimes they have to sign agreements and not even discuss it with their own spouses. They can't tell anybody. Meanwhile, the investigators are being able to interview everybody. They can get documents, all of these things. It takes a very long process. It's intimidating and draining. I, for example, was accused of anti-gay bias because I took about 100 students to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library for a conference that had nothing to do with gay issues at all. But because it was the Reagan Library and because there was a pamphlet somewhere, I was brought under charges and I was investigated for hundreds of days. I can tell you, it is exhausting. It's very intimidating. It makes you not want to step out into this debate or express these views at all. So your teaching all of a sudden starts to become effective because you're scared as a teacher. This is what you've put your life into. This is what you've dedicated all your studies to. You want to reach young minds, and instead of being able to reach them, you're constantly afraid of your students. And I do have documented cases of activists recruiting and coaching students who are in people's classes with the express purpose of filing a complaint. If they can't find something very specific, they may provoke the teacher. They may try to do things to try to get the teacher to say something. All right? Service is an area of colleges and universities and schools all the way down to kindergarten that deals with who's advising the clubs, who's on the committees who are determining what goes into the library, right? Who talks about what kind of technology can be brought in, who oversees the acquisition of new curriculum materials, or says who gets to go on sabbatical. And they investigate sometimes each other. So sometimes you have to do personnel reviews on your peers. Once this LGBT curriculum gets into the system, all of a sudden, all of those tasks are affected. Because how many of you have seen in the news the colleges that get in trouble because they invite someone to come speak on campus and people don't like it, right? That gets affected. Who is allowed to come to campus? What can you use school funds for? It's very, very obvious, the distinction. On most public school grounds, you can use public funds to start a gay-straight alliance or a gay club even as young as 6th grade, but you cannot use that money to start a Christian club, right? Even on many Christian campuses. That's one of the chapters in my book. Some of the Christian schools are even worse than the secular schools about this. So this is a very, very difficult area. In terms of credentialing, Sister Sharon talked about what happened when she was trying to get her teacher credential. Once this material gets into the system, they can make it part of credentialing. And I've taught many, many people who were in college because they were going to get their teaching credentials. And in the 90s and in the early 2000s, I think a lot of the people that were in those programs, they took it as a joke. They were kind of cynical. They said, we have to do all this inclusivity stuff, this LGBT training. It's not that big of a deal. But now we have generations of teachers who are coming through, and they've been immersed in this ideology and in this disciplinary study for decades, and they believe it. These are true believers, the people who are getting the certificates. They're coming out. They believe that somebody like me is the devil. They believe that everything that comes out of my mouth is hate speech because there's a profile on me by the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. So in their mind, if they don't like him, then everything he says must be wrong. Okay? And now it's to the point where you can't get your certificate unless you are a believer. You have to show more and more that you're enthusiastic, that this is something that you've internalized, that you really, really buy into this ideology. And so it affects who is able to get a credential. So, and then the administration, obviously, those are the decisions made at the principal level. And so you have to understand that the introduction of this curriculum it doesn't just affect the one area about, one little part of the school. Education is an enormous machinery, and all the parts are connected to every other part. And I don't say this because I started out by wanting to be hostile to the LGBT agenda. As someone who grew up in the community, I never would have wanted that. But I have seen over 20 years in education that this particular agenda is very, very bad for education because of the fact that it has a way of changing the functions and the processes and really distorting the mission at every level of education. And I say this with the final thought that you have to react the minute that you see it. You've got to be able to mobilize, to try to find out information, and you have to push back before the whole machine turns. Thank you.